occupation. So why is Iran always getting this pass from the international community? They do the smallest thing, and we're saying, oh, well, maybe they're improving. Well, the reason is simple. It's a matter of assumptions. If you expect everything of someone, you're going to forgive nothing of them. And if you expect nothing of someone, you're going to forgive everything of them. And that has been the systematic way in which Israel has been treated vis-a-vis its neighbors, at least in small part because we treat Israel as a country that can do no wrong. And so when it does do something wrong, we treat it not just as a mistake, but as a crime. And we have to move away from that. We have to insist, you were talking about, what's my Zionism? Zionism for me is the concept of Jewish possibility. And Jewish possibility has to be premised on some idea of Jewish imperfection. And that's a reality we need to think about. Let me make two other points and then turn it over to questions. One of the things that I find very disturbing, not least because I'm an op-ed writer for a conservative editorial page, and this kind of criticism you often find coming from the political right, is that American soldiers are dying in the Middle East basically at the behest, if not explicitly at the behest, but at least in the interests of Israel. And you saw this, there was a controversy with David Petraeus last year in which he said something that mildly suggested this idea. Pat Buchanan says this even more strongly. We're sending our boys to die in Kabul so that the Likud can get its way. Well, you hear this a lot. I'm amazed by this argument, and I'm amazed that it's not rebutted more often. American soldiers have died for the sake of Iraqis, Afghans, Kuwaitis, Saudis, Somalis, Bosnians, Kosovars, all Muslims. Not a single American soldier has ever died for Israel. Not a single American soldier has ever died to defend Israel. It's an absolute statement of fact. Israel defends itself. That case has to be made, that one of the reasons we like Israel as an ally is because it is a self-reliant nation. And yes, we do help it with $3 billion of aid, but they put that aid to very good use because we don't have to save their kosher bacon every few years, the way we have to go and save Saudi Arabia from Iran or from Iraq or save other countries and really put lives at risk. Final point, this is a point I make to every audience I speak to, so if you've heard me speak before, you'll hear me say it again, but it's important. And it's particularly important in the case of the boycott, the BDS campaign. People who are in the BDS campaign all consider themselves liberals and progressives. All of them, or almost all of them. It is a movement that's coming politically from the left. Some exceptions, but basically it's coming from the left. Now this is astonishing to me. It's astonishing because the most powerful case that anyone can make for Israel is the liberal case for Israel. Now, you heard me speak earlier about how I can't stand this point in which people say Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, therefore it's worthy of our support. I don't like that case because when you speak of democracy, you're speaking about a process, but you're not actually addressing fundamental values, ideals. It's just a mechanism. But you have to defend Israel. You can defend Israel by speaking directly to values. I meet with these college students. I say, how many of you are in favor of gay rights? They all raise their hands. Fantastic. Me too. How many of you are opposed to don't ask, don't tell? They all raise their hands. Great. Wonderful. Fabulous. Me too. How many of you believe that women should have the same choices and opportunities in life as men do? Well, good. 100% unanimity there. All right. How many of you think that if you're an artist, you have a right to offend not only the aesthetic, but the moral sensibilities of your audience? All hands go up. Free press, you're for that? Yeah? Good. Speaking truth to power. Fabulous. What about politicians if they're accused of a crime of some kind, that they should be held accountable for those crimes? They all raise their hands. It's fabulous. How many of you are opposed to the death penalty? Most hands go up. Fabulous. Fantastic. How many of you think that minorities should be represented in government? They all raise their hands. How many of you consider yourselves environmentalists? Do you consider that environmental stewardship is a really fundamental obligation of any serious advanced government? People should care about the land and the quality of the land and the air and the sea. They all raise their hand. At that point I say, look, those are your values, the only country in the Middle East that supports them is Israel. Because you don't find gay rights in Palestine. In fact, you find a terrorized gay community in Palestine. You don't find women's rights in Saudi Arabia. In Saudi Arabia, if a woman is raped, she's the one who's punished. You don't find rights of artistic and cultural expression in Iran. It's completely censored. You don't find minority representation in most of the Middle East. Look at what's happening in Bahrain, where the government is Sunni and 85% of the country is Shiite. Go down the list. At that point, you say, look, it's very simple. If you're a member of the Muslim Brotherhood or a sympathizer with it, you don't like Israel, I can't persuade you. It's theological. We have our differences. But if you're a liberal and a progressive, and the only country that you oppose and you think is illegitimate is Israel, then you're either a fool or a hypocrite. That case has to be made again and again. It's such a simple, easy, low-hanging fruit type of case to make. So I think that if we can do this, if we can basically up our game, we're not going to persuade the people who really hate us, the people who lead the BDS campaigns, who are in it for disingenuous motives. But you can start to turn the conversation with for a generation of people for whom hating Israel is like a fashion statement. You can get them to say, you know, the clothes that you're wearing that you think are so great, actually, they look like shit. You look stupid and foolish. And you don't really want to be wearing that. You don't want to be seen looking like that, saying those things, because you'll come to regret it. If you can make that case in a friendly way, in a persuasive way, I think that we're going to start to turn this thing around. So on that note, thank you.
Yell your question really loud so we get it and everyone can hear it.
Just touch on briefly like the BDS campaign in the United States and how a lot of funding is coming from the European Union and foreign governments, and maybe what ordinary people like us can do about it, what our government should be doing about it.
You know, you should ask Gerald Steinberg that question because I don't really follow it that closely. Ultimately, it's hard to track these funding flows, and it seems to me, there are plenty of movements that are extremely well funded, but the funding doesn't really influence the success of the argument. So I have no idea whether the EU is sponsoring any part of it. I mean, you see it from time to time in the work of certain academics who are prominent Israel haters, and then it turns out they're giving, they're making $75,000 per speech in Abu Dhabi or Dubai. No surprises. No surprises there. But again, I'm sort of loath even to accept the premise of the question, which is to say the power of the BDS campaign stems from the idea that these guys are just really loaded, because in a way it's a kind of mirror image of the accusation that's made of the pro-Israel movement, that I'm speaking here on behalf of Israel because the network of my influential Zionist friends is paying me mountains of money to do that. No, it's not. Well, it's not paying me mountains of money, A. But B, I shouldn't say this, but I would be speaking on behalf of Israel even if I weren't being paid mountains of money. It has nothing, the financial aspect doesn't really inform the fundamental sense of conviction at work here. And so I think it's, there's a side of Jewish life that's always examining this stuff, like who's giving money to J Street and all the rest of it. And the idea that maybe J Street has some Arab donors is dispositive proof of their malice and ill intentions. I don't want to make that argument against J Street. They have to get money from wherever they can get money. And whether it's George Soros or Sheikh whatever, then fine. Where they have to be challenged really is at the level of ideas.
I appreciate very much you taking the time to speak your position on it. Have you always been so knowledgeable, and if not, what kind of pushed you to learn about it, and where does that passion come from?
So the first time I went to Israel, I went to Israel as a child. I have some relatives over there. But the second time I went to Israel, I stayed on a kibbutz with my obnoxious, petty, horrible relatives. literally just hated every minute of the experience. I was like 16 or 17 years old. And just to make my point, when I got out of JFK, I think I was 16, my mother was there to pick me up at the airport. I made a point of wearing a keffiyeh and like a full kaftan and Ray-Ban sunglasses. So I wasn't always quite so pro-Israel. I'll tell you briefly how it really began. I mean, I've always been interested in these issues, and despite my kibbutz experience, I was always essentially sympathetic to Israel. But when I was, the first time I went to work for the Wall Street Journal, I was sent to Europe, where I was supposed to be writing about regulatory issues for the European Union. This was in 2000. At the time, the guy who used to write about Israel for the journal's editorial page returned to the States. So I was kind of handed the job of just being the guy writing these editorials. And right after the failure of Camp David, I was asked by my editor to fly out, really not so much to Israel, but to the Palestinian Authority, because Arafat was threatening to declare a state on September 13th of that year, which was the 7th anniversary of the signing of the Oslo Accords. And so my assignment was, what kind of state is it going to be if he declares one? So instead of sort of doing the usual route of the settlements, Israelis, et cetera, I tried to see things through a really purely Palestinian lens. So I spent a lot of time in Gaza, in Jenin, Ramallah, interviewed all kinds of people, Hamas, all these characters. And the impression that I came away with was that this was a kleptocratic, dysfunctional, sclerotic state that was breeding fanatics and fanaticism and encouraging it, and that the peace process was about to explode. And I wrote that in a piece that appeared 9 days before the Second Intifada began. It was called Palestine, the Dream and the Nightmare. And then 9 days later, of course, it erupts, and then I became really interested in the topic. One other thing happened, which is I was based in Brussels at the time, so I returned to Brussels from Israel. Intifada breaks out, and I'm this like curious character because my name is Stephens, but weirdly I'm Jewish. I mean, my grandfather just decided he wanted the blandest Anglo-Saxon name he could think of, and that's what he came up with, Stephens. And so I was privy to conversations among journalists, like in Brussels, it's like you just go hang out with other guys. And I was astonished by the kind of conversations that they were having, in which Israel was not only to blame for the Intifada, a lot of people thought that, thanks man, not only to blame, but that it was essentially this idea of, well, what a French ambassador once said, this shitty little country that was sending the world careening towards war. I mean, there was just a lot of basically naked anti-Semitism written into that criticism. People just would say this to me not knowing that I was Jewish. And so that was an animating force. So I just became obsessed with the topic and started going out there all the time. I was in Israel on September 11th. I learned of the attacks from the passport control people. First time ever in my life that I've had people have been pleasant to me at the Israeli airport, at Ben Gurion Airport, was when, because you go on, you're a journalist, were you going to Ramallah? And so they're usually treated with total hostility. And that night, I spent my time wandering between East and West Jerusalem. And in East Jerusalem, there was a look of just utter glee. Like Arafat tried to tamp it down, but I don't know if any of you were around here when the OJ verdict came down in the mid-90s. I remember that day where clearly you were like, oh my God, there are these two countries here, totally different reactions to what had happened. Well, that was my point of reference on 9/11 to what happened. You go to East Jerusalem, it's like people were fantastic. Yeah, it's great. And then on the western side, just a sense of huge loss and fear. And so that too had something to do with my education.